The rifle cracked against Cale's shoulder as he fired into the stormy night. The bullet meant for the coyote that had been stalking his remaining cattle. Instead, the shot echoed off the canyon walls, just as a woman's scream pierced the darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs as he sprinted toward the sound. Boots sliding in the mud, knowing he'd made a terrible mistake. She lay crumpled against the fallen log. Her designer clothes torn and muddy, dark hair plastered to her face. Blood seeped from a gash on her forehead, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. Cale dropped to his knees beside her, his scarred hands trembling as he checked for the wound he prayed his bullet hadn't caused. "Please don't be dead," he whispered. His voice rusty from years of speaking only to horses and ghosts. Her eyes fluttered open, the color of winter storms, and, fixed on his face with startling intensity, Did you... Did you just try to kill me?" "Christ, no," I was aiming for. He stopped, studying her pale features. Even injured and terrified, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. "What the hell are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? Running?" The word came out broken, and she struggled to sit up. "I was running from," her voice caught, and she looked over her shoulder into the darkness as if demons might emerge from the shadows. Cale had been running from demons. For 3 years, ever since the accident that had destroyed everything he'd ever loved. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same haunted desperation he saw in his own reflection. From what? From a life that was never mine. She pressed her hand to her bleeding forehead, and he saw the massive diamond ring on her finger catch. The moonlight. I was supposed to marry him tomorrow, supposed to smile and pretend and disappear into his world forever. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the rain began to fall harder. Cale knew he should take her to town, to the sheriff, to anywhere but his isolated ranch, where he'd been hiding from the world. But something in her eyes stopped him, a wildness that matched the storm, desperate freedom that called to the part of him he'd buried. "I can't go back," she said, reading his thoughts. "Please. I know you don't know me, but I can't go back." The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. She was clearly for money, clearly trouble, clearly everything he'd sworn to avoid. When she looked at him with those storm-colored eyes, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the desire to protect someone other than himself. "What's your name?" he asked, shrugging out of his jacket to wrap around her shoulders. "Lyra." She pulled his jacket tighter, and he caught a hint of expensive perfume mixed with rain and fear. "Lyra Ashworth. Though I suppose that name won't mean much out here." It didn't. In these mountains, titles and money meant less than the ability to survive, to endure, to keep going when everything fell apart. Cale had learned that lesson the hard way. "Can you walk?" He stood and offered her his hand, noting how small and soft it felt in his calloused palm. "My place isn't far. You can... figure out what comes next from there." She nodded, struggling to her feet, and he saw her wince as she put weight on her left ankle. Without thinking, he swept her up in his arms, and she gasped, her hands gripping his shoulders. "I can manage," she protested, but she didn't pull away. "So can I," he said, and started walking toward the distant lights of his ranch, carrying this broken woman who had stumbled into his shadow-filled world and somehow made him want to step back into the light. The ranch house looked like it had been abandoned by hope itself. Lyra took in the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the windows dark as dead eyes, and wondered if she'd traded one prison for another. But when Cale kicked open the door and carried her inside, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years' safety. "It's not much," he said, setting her down on a worn leather couch that had seen better decades, "but it's hidden." The interior was sparse, but clean, everything functional rather than decorative. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes telling stories of lonely nights. Books were stacked everywhere on shelves, tables, even the floor as if he'd been trying to read his way out of whatever darkness had claimed him. "You live here alone?" she asked, watching him move through the space with the careful economy of someone who'd learned to need nothing from anyone. For 3 years, he disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, returning with a first aid kit and a bottle of whiskey. This might sting. She held still as he cleaned the cut on her forehead, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his fingers. Up close, she could see the scars that marked his hands and arms, some old, some newer, all telling stories of pain endured in silence. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, his hands stilled against her skin. "Same thing that happened to you, I'm guessing?" "Life decided I needed to learn how much I could lose." The whiskey burned, but not as much as the understanding in his dark eyes. She'd spent months surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful accessory, a prize to be won. But Cale looked at her like she was human, damaged perhaps, but real. "Tell me about him," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "The man you were supposed to marry?" Cassius Holbrook. Railroad money, political connections, the kind of man who's never been told no. She touched the ring on her finger, this symbol of her gilded cage. "My father owed him money, a lot of money, so he offered me as collateral, and you agreed?" "Tried to find another way for 2 years." The words came out hollow, defeated. "But Cassius made it clear that if I didn't marry him, he'd destroy what was left of my family. My younger sister, my mother, they'd lose everything." Cale was quiet, for a long moment, studying her face. "So you ran." "I got in my car and drove until I couldn't drive anymore. Then I started walking." She laughed bitterly. "Don't even know where I am. The middle of nowhere, Colorado. About as far from civilization as you can get without leaving the country. Perfect." She meant it. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Thunder crashed overhead and rain began hammering against the windows. Cale stood and moved to the fireplace, building a fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the stubble that couldn't hide the strength of his jaw. "You can stay tonight," he said without looking at her. "Storm's too bad to go anywhere." "Anyway, and tomorrow?" "Tomorrow you decide what you want, more freedom or safety." She watched him work, noting the way his shoulders moved under his flannel shirt, the careful way he arranged the logs. Everything about him spoke of isolation, of someone who'd learned to be his own company. But there was something else too, a warmth that he tried to hide but couldn't quite extinguish. "What did you lose?" she asked. He went still, his hand frozen on the poker. "Everything that mattered. I'm sorry, don't be. Sorry doesn't change anything." He finally turned to face her, and she saw years of pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "But running away doesn't either. Then what does?" "I don't know yet." He moved to the window, staring out into the storm. "But I'm starting to think maybe it's not about changing what happened. Maybe it's about learning to live with it." Lyra studied his profile, this man who'd emerged from the darkness to save her from her own demons. There was something about him that made her want to stay, to fight, to believe that maybe freedom was worth the risk after all. "Cale," she said, and he turned at the sound of his name on her lips. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not taking me back to town. For giving me a choice." He nodded once, then disappeared down a hallway, returning with blankets and a pillow. "You can have the couch. I'll be in the barn, if you need anything." "You don't have to?" "Yes, I do." His voice was rough. "You're the first person to set foot in this house in 3 years. I need some space to figure out what that means." As he headed for the door, she called out to him. "Cale, what you said about learning to live with it, do you think that's possible?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Ask me tomorrow." Cale couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, saw Lyra's face, the way she'd looked at him with those storm-colored eyes, the way she'd fit perfectly in his arms, the way she'd made him feel human again for the first time in 3 years. He paced the barn, running his hands through his hair, trying to convince himself that come morning, he'd drive her to town and forget she'd ever existed. But even as he formed the plan, he knew it was a lie. Something had shifted the moment she'd stumbled into his world, and there was no going back. The sound of the kitchen door opening made him freeze. Through the barn window, he could see her silhouette moving through his house, and panic clawed at his chest. No one had touched his things, moved through his space, existed in his sanctuary, since he was through the barn door before conscious thought caught up with him. his heart hammering as he burst into the kitchen to find her standing at the stove, making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. "I'm sorry," she said without turning around. "I couldn't sleep, and I thought, don't touch that." The words came out harsher than he intended, and she stepped back from the stove as if burned. "I'm sorry. I just... No one's used that stove since ... Since who?" asked softly. The question hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the doorframe, struggling to breathe, to think, to remember why he'd built these walls in the first place. "My wife. Her name was Vera."
Lyra.
Went very still. She died 3 years ago. Car accident. The words felt like broken glass in his throat. She was pregnant. We were going to have a daughter, O'Kale." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. It was my fault. He hadn't meant to say it. Hadn't said it out loud to another human being since the funeral. We'd been fighting about money, about the ranch, about everything." She stormed out, and I let her go. If I'd followed her, if I'd stop. Lyra crossed the kitchen and placed her hands on his chest, forcing him to look at her. "You can't live in the if only. Trust me, I've tried." Her touch burned through his shirt, and he wanted to pull away, to maintain the distance that had kept him safe. But something in her eyes, understanding, compassion, a shared recognition of grief, made him stay. "Is that why you hide out here?" she asked. "Because you blame yourself? Because I can't bear to be around people who look at me with pity? Because everywhere I went, I saw her? Because the world kept spinning when mine had stopped?" He was shaking now, years of buried emotion, threatening to tear him apart. "Because I was supposed to protect her, and I failed." "And you think punishing yourself will bring her back?" "I think punishing myself is what I deserve." Lyra studied his face, her hand still pressed against his chest. "You know what I think? I think you're scared." "Of what?" "Of living again." "Caring about someone again?" "Of taking the risk that comes with loving someone." Her voice was gentle, but unyielding. "You're scared that if you let yourself feel anything, you might lose it again." Oh, she was right. And the truth of it made him want to run. But her hands on his chest anchored him, kept him from fleeing into the familiar darkness of his guilt. "If I do?" he asked. "What if I let myself care about you and something happens?" "Then we'll deal with it together," she smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "But what if we don't? What if we have something beautiful? Even if it's not forever? You don't understand. I can't lose someone else. I won't survive." You survived losing Vera, barely, but you did." She moved closer, and he could smell her perfume, could feel the warmth of her body, and maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't have to have guarantees. Maybe we just have to have right now. He looked down at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his world and somehow seen straight through to the heart of him. She was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of hope. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he admitted. "I don't know how to be around people, how to care about someone, how to love someone." The word hung between them like a challenge. He thought of Vera, of the guilt that had consumed him, of the walls he'd built to keep the world at bay. But he also thought of last night, of the way it had felt to hold Lyra in his arms, of the way she'd looked at him like he was worth saving. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "I'm already hurt." Her smile was sad but real. "We both are. Maybe ... maybe we can heal each other." He reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. She leaned into his touch, and he felt something crack open in his chest. The painful breaking of loss, but the tentative flowering of possibility. "Lyra," he whispered, and she rose up on her toes to kiss him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two wounded souls testing whether they could still feel something beautiful. But then her arms wound around his neck, and he pulled her closer. And suddenly he was drowning in the taste of her, in the way she made him feel alive again. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what I'm doing, neither do I," she said. "But I know I don't want to run anymore. Even if it means facing whatever's chasing you. Even then." She kissed him again, softer this time. "As long as I don't have to face it alone." Black SUV appeared on the horizon like a storm cloud, dust billowing in its wake as it ate up the miles to Cale's ranch. He saw it through the kitchen window while Lyra was in the shower, and his blood turned to ice. "Lyra," he called out, grabbing his rifle from the gun cabinet. "We've got company." She appeared in the doorway, hair dripping, wrapped in his robe. And the domestic intimacy of the moment would have stolen his breath if not for the approaching vehicle. They'd spent 3 days learning each other, her laugh, his scars, the way she hummed while cooking, the way he watched her like she might disappear. 3 days of pretending the outside world didn't exist. "Is it?" she started to ask, but the look on his face gave her the answer. "Get dressed. Now." He moved to the window, watching the SUV draw closer. "How did they find you?" "I don't know. I left my phone, my car." She stopped, her hand going to her throat. "The necklace was my grandmother's. Cassius gave it to me, said it was a family heirloom. But what? But it wasn't my grandmother's. It was his mother's." Her face went pale. "Oh God, Cale. What if there's a tracker?" The SUV pulled into his driveway, and 3 men in expensive suits stepped out. Even from a distance, Cale could see. They weren't just muscle. They moved with the confidence of men who'd never been told no, who'd never faced consequences for their actions. "Lyra Ashworth." The man in the center called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I know you're in there. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized people." Cale had faced down wolves, bears, and his own demons, but something about the man's voice made his skin crawl. This was predator calling to prey, and every instinct he had screamed danger. "Who is he?" Cale asked, though he already knew. "Cassius." Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "He found me. Then we run." "Where?" "He has resources, connections. There's nowhere I can go that he won't find me." Cale looked at her, this woman who'd brought light back into his world, who'd made him believe in possibilities again, and felt something shift inside him. For 3 years he'd been running from life, hiding from pain, avoiding any situation that might require him to fight for something that mattered. But Lyra mattered. She mattered more than his safety, more than his solitude, more than the fear that had kept him prisoner in his own home. "Then we don't run," he said, checking his rifle. "We fight, Cale. No, you don't understand what you're up against. Cassius owns judges, politicians, police departments. He can destroy you. He can. Try." He moved to the gun cabinet and pulled out a shotgun, checking the chamber. "But this is my land, my home. And you're under my protection. You can't protect me from him. Watch me." The confidence in his voice surprised them both. For the first time in 3 years, Cale felt like himself again, not the broken man who'd been drowning in guilt, but the man who'd built this ranch with his own hands, who'd survived loss and grief and the kind of pain that would have destroyed a weaker soul. "Last chance, Lyra," Cassius called out. "Come out now, or I'll have to come in and get you." Cale moved to the front door, rifle in hand. "This is private property," he called back. "You're trespassing, and you're harboring my fiancée, Cassius's." The voice was smooth, cultured, but underneath it was steel. "I'm not leaving without her." "Then you're not leaving." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Cale had spent 3 years avoiding confrontation. But now he felt the familiar weight of the rifle in his hands, the steady calm that came with protecting something precious. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Cassius said, stepping closer to the porch. "I can have this place condemned, your assets frozen, your life destroyed with a single phone call. Maybe." Cale stepped onto the porch, and the 3 men instinctively moved back. There was something in his stance, his voice, that spoke of violence carefully controlled, but you'll have to make that call from somewhere else. "I'm offering you money," Cassius said, his tone changing to one of reasonable businessmen. "Name your price. Whatever she's paying you, I'll double it." "She's not paying me anything? Then what's your interest in this? You don't know her, don't owe her anything. Why risk your life for a woman you just met?" Cale thought of Lyra's laugh, of the way she'd looked at him that morning when she thought he was still asleep, of the way she'd kissed him like he was something precious. He thought of the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out, and the man he might become again with her beside him. "Because she's mine," he said simply, and I protect what's mine. She belongs to me, Cassius snarled, his composure finally cracking. She's my fiancée, my property, my she's not property. Cale's voice was deadly quiet. She's a person with the right to choose her own life. Not when her family owes me $50 million, then her family can pay you back. But she's not for sale. Cassius laughed, but there was no humor in it. You really think you can stand against me? Own this entire county? The sheriff, the judges, the mayor, they all dance to my tune. Then maybe it's time someone taught you a new song. The standoff stretched between them, 3 men in suits facing 1 man with a rifle, and everything to lose. Cale felt Lyra's presence behind him, felt her fear and her hope, and knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't let her face it alone. You have 10 seconds to get off my property, Cale said, raising the rifle. After that, I start shooting. You wouldn't dare. Try me. And in that moment, looking into Cale's eyes, Cassius finally understood that he was facing something he'd never encountered before, a man who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. The first shot shattered the morning silence, and Cassius dove behind his SUV as Cale's warning shot kicked up dust 2 feet from his expensive shoes. The message was clear. The broken rancher wasn't bluffing. You're insane, Cassius shouted from behind the vehicle. Can't just shoot at people. Can't on my own property when they refuse to leave, Cale called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. And that was a warning. The next one won't be. Behind him, Lyra had grabbed the shotgun from the cabinet, her hands shaking but her jaw set with determination. What's the plan? Keep them pinned down until they realize this isn't worth dying for. And if they don't? Cale looked at her, this woman who'd stumbled into his world and made him remember what it felt like to be alive. Then we make our stand together. One of Cassius's men, a thick-set bruiser with cold eyes, tried to circle around the side of the house. Cale tracked him with the rifle, and the man stopped dead when he realized he was in the crosshairs. Wouldn't? Cale said conversationally. I can put a bullet through a dime at 200 yards. You're a much bigger target. This is kidnapping, Cassius screamed. I'll have you arrested. Call the sheriff, Cale replied. Tell him you're on my property threatening my woman. See what he has to say about that. The truth was, Cale wasn't sure what Sheriff Morrison would do. Cassius might own half the county, but Morrison was old school, a man who believed in right and wrong, not in the power of money. At least, Cale hoped so. You're a woman? Cassius's voice was venomous. She's carrying my ring. Not anymore, Lyra said, stepping onto the porch beside Cale. She held up her left hand, showing that it was bare. I dropped it in the well this morning. Cale felt a surge of pride watching her stand there, chin raised, fear transformed into defiance. This was the woman who'd been hidden under layers of compliance and terror fears, brave, magnificent. Can't do this to me, Cassius snarled. Won't let you destroy everything I've worked for. What you worked for? Lyra laughed, and the sound was bitter as winter wind. You mean what you inherited? What you stole? What you built on the backs of people like my father? Your father was a fool who made bad investments. My father was a good man who trusted the wrong person. Her voice rose with years of suppressed anger. You manipulated him, trapped him, and when he couldn't pay, you demanded me as collateral, like I was livestock. You were nothing before I chose you. Nobody. A small-town nobody with a pretty face and no prospects. The words hit like physical blows, but Lyra didn't flinch. Maybe I was nobody, but I'd rather be nobody than be owned by you. Gale had been listening to the exchange, but his attention was split between Lyra and Cassius's men. The bruiser was trying to work his way around the house again, while the third, Manyanga, nervous-looking, was edging toward the barn. They're trying to flank us, he murmured to Lyra. What do we do? Make them think twice. He fired again, this time putting a bullet through the side window of the SUV. The glass exploded, and all 3 men hit the ground. Next bullet goes. Through something vital, Cale called out. Your choice what that is? You're making a mistake, Cassius said, but his voice had lost some of its arrogance. I can make you rich. Name your price. I already told you. She's not for sale. Everyone's for sale. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Cale thought of Vera, of the life he'd built and lost, of the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. Money couldn't buy back the dead, couldn't erase mistakes, couldn't fill the empty spaces that loss carved in a soul. You're wrong, he said. Some things can't be bought. Like what? Like love, like loyalty, like the right to choose. Your own life, love. Cassius laughed. You've known her for 3 days. Long enough to know she's worth fighting for. The sound of approaching vehicles made everyone freeze. Dust clouds rose from the valley road, and Cale counted at least 3 trucks heading their way. His heart sank if Cassius had called in. Reinforcements? They were outnumbered and outgunned. But as the trucks drew closer, Cale recognized the lead vehicle. Sheriff Morrison's pickup, followed by 2 other ranch trucks he knew belonged to his neighbors, the Valdez family and old Pete Garrett. Looks like the cavalry's arrived, Lyra said, squeezing his arm. Not sure whose cavalry, Cale replied, but he felt a flicker of hope. The trucks pulled up behind Cassius's SUV, and Sheriff Morrison stepped out, his hand resting on his gun. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, but his voice was calm and measured. Seems we have ourselves a situation, he said, looking between Cale and Cassius. Want to tell me what's going on? This man is holding? My fiancée against her will, Cassius said immediately. I demand you arrest him. That true, Cale? Morrison asked. She's here of her own free will, Cale replied, and she's made it clear she doesn't want to go with him. Morrison looked at Lyra, who stepped forward. I'm here by choice, Sheriff. Mr. Holbrook has been persistent in his courtship, but I've decided not to marry him. Persistent, Cassius exploded. We have a contract? A contract? Morrison's voice was dangerously quiet. You have a contract? On a woman? A marriage contract? Her father signed it. Her father can't sign away his daughter's right to choose, Morrison said. This isn't the Middle Ages, Mr. Holbrook. Behind the sheriff, Cale saw his neighbor's people he'd barely spoken to in 3 years. But who'd come when they heard shots? Fired, they were armed, grim-faced, and clearly on his side. You have a choice, Mr. Holbrook, Morrison continued. You can leave peacefully, or I can arrest you for trespassing and threatening behavior. No, you can't do this to me, Cassius said, but his voice was losing its power. I have rights. So does she, Morrison replied. Right now she's choosing. To stay here? The weeks that followed Cassius's retreat were the most peaceful of Cale's life since losing Vera. He and Lyra fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing coffee at dawn. Work around the ranch, quiet evenings by the fire. She had gentle hands with the horses and a laugh that made the old house feel alive again, but he could see the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she sometimes stared at the road, as if expecting black SUVs to appear. On the horizon, it's not going to give up, she said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Cassius doesn't lose, and he certainly doesn't lose to people like us. People like us? People who aren't rich enough to buy justice? Connected enough to make problems disappear? Powerful enough to rewrite the rules? She curled closer to him on the porch swing, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He's probably already found another way to come at us. She was right, and they both knew it. But for the first time in 3 years, Cale found himself planning for a future instead of just surviving each day. He'd started making repairs to the house, fixing the loose boards on the porch, replacing the broken windows. Small things, but they felt like promises. There's something I need to tell you, Lyra said, her voice unusually quiet. What is it? I called my father yesterday, but you were in town getting supplies. Cale went still, and Cassius was there, at the house. Told my father that if I don't come back and marry him, he's going to foreclose on everything. The house, the business, everything my family has worked for. That's not your responsibility, isn't it? She turned to face him, and he saw the pain in her eyes. My father made a stupid decision, yes. But he did it trying to save the business, trying to provide for our family. And now, my little sister might lose her college fund. My mother might lose her home, Because I'm too selfish to sacrifice myself for them? It's not selfish to want to choose your own life, even if that choice destroys the people I love. Cale was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of her dilemma. He'd spent 3 years running from responsibility, from the possibility of caring about someone enough to risk losing them. But loving someone, truly loving them, being willing to fight for them, to sacrifice for them. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stay here with you. I want to wake up in your arms every morning and fall asleep listening to your heartbeat every night. I want to help you rebuild this place, make it ours instead of just yours." Her voice broke. "But I can't do that knowing my family is paying the price." "Then we don't let them pay the price." "How? We don't have $50 million. "No, but we have something else." "What?" "We have each other, and we have the truth." That night, Cale made a decision that would have terrified him a month ago. He called an old friend, a war buddy, who'd become a private investigator in Denver, asked him to dig into Cassius Holbrook's business dealings. "What am I looking for?" Jake asked. "Anything that doesn't smell right? Men like Holbrook don't get that rich without cutting corners." "Somewhere. And if I find something, then we use it." 3 days later, Jake called back with news that made Cale's blood run cold. Cassius hadn't just been predatory in his business dealings, he'd been criminal. Fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and worse. The man had a network of judges and politicians protecting him, but he also had enemies who'd been waiting for someone brave enough to bring him down. "There's a federal prosecutor in Denver who's been building a case against him for 2 years, Jake said. "But she needs someone willing to testify, someone with inside knowledge of his operations." "Lyra's father? He'd be perfect. But he's terrified." Holbrook's made it clear that cooperation would be ... unhealthy. What if he had protection? From who? Holbrook owns half the state, from the feds, and from me. That evening, Cale sat Lyra down and told her everything. Her face went pale as he described the extent of Cassius's criminal empire, but he also saw something else in her eyes: hope. "If your father testifies," Cale said, "Cassius goes to prison. The debt disappears. Your family is safe, and you're free. And if he doesn't, then we find another way." "What if there isn't another way?" Cale took her hands in his, these soft hands that had learned to handle horses and mend fences and heal the broken places in his heart. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." "You'd really do that? Risk everything for my family?" "I'd risk everything for you." She kissed him then, soft and desperate, and he tasted tears on her lips. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I love you too." The words came easier than he'd expected, carrying years of healing and hope. "Which is why we're going to win this." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've already lost everything once. I know what it feels like to survive that kind of pain. And I know that what we have is worth fighting for." The next morning, they drove to Denver together. Lyra's hand clasped tightly in his as they headed toward a confrontation that would determine their future. For the first time in 3 years, Cale wasn't running from the possibility of loss. He was running toward the chance of building something beautiful with the woman who'd lit a fire in his heart. The federal courthouse in Denver felt like a cathedral of justice, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of those seeking truth. Cale stood beside Lyra in the hallway outside the prosecutor's office, watching her father pace nervously while her mother and sister sat in stunned silence. "Can't do this," Richard Ashworth said for the 10th time, his hands shaking as he clutched a briefcase full of documents. "If I testify against Cassius, he'll destroy what's left of my family." "He's already destroying your family," Lyra said gently. "He's using us as leverage to keep you quiet. You don't understand the reach this man has. I understand that you're..." "Scared?" Cale interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I understand that you made a mistake and you've been paying for it ever since. But right now, you have a chance to make it right." Federal Prosecutor Miranda Santos emerged from her office, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who moved with the confidence of someone who'd taken down much bigger fish than Cassius Holbrook. "Mr. Ashworth, we need to discuss your testimony." "Don't know if I can. You can," Santos said firmly. "And you will. Because if you don't, Cassius Holbrook will continue to own you, your daughter. and everyone else he's got under his thumb. She led them into a conference room where the evidence was spread across a massive table bank records. Recorded conversations, photographs, witness statements. Years of careful investigation had painted a picture of a man who'd built his empire on the suffering of others. Your business records show a pattern of Holbrook deliberately creating debt traps, Santos explained to Richard. He'd loan money to small businesses at reasonable rates, then change the terms midway through, making it impossible for them to pay back. When they defaulted, he'd seize their assets and often force them into personal arrangements. Personal arrangements? Lyra's voice was ice. Wives, daughters, sons. He has a collection of people he considers his property, all bound to him by impossible debts he engineered. Cale felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Many others? Dozens? Maybe more. Your daughter isn't the first woman he's tried to force into marriage, and she won't be the last unless we stop him. The weight of that revelation hung in the air like smoke. Lyra gripped Cale's hand tighter, and he saw the moment she made her decision. I'll testify to, she said. Lyra? No, her father started. Yes. I'll testify about the threats, the coercion, the way he talked about owning me. Her voice grew stronger with each word. And I'll testify about what he did when I tried to leave. What did he do? Santos asked. He sent men to drag me back. Armed men who threatened the man I love, who tried to intimidate us into submission. On his own property? Santos smiled grimly. Interstate transport for the purpose of coercion? That's a federal crime. 2 hours later, they emerged from the courthouse with a plan. Richard would testify about the fraudulent business practices. Lyra would testify about the personal coercion, and Cale would testify about the armed intimidation. In exchange, the government would provide protection and ensure that all of Cassius's illegal debts were voided. What happens now? Lyra asked as they stood on the courthouse steps. Now we go home and wait, Santos said. Holbrook will be arrested. Within the week, Cassius wasn't going to wait for arrest. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table in Cale's ranch house, planning their future together, the sound of helicopters filled the air. He's making his move, Cale said, grabbing his rifle. He knows we talked to the feds. How many men does he have? Lyra asked, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. Doesn't matter. Cale checked his weapon, then looked at the woman who'd changed his life. This ends tonight. The helicopters landed in his pasture, and armed men poured out like ants from a disturbed hill. But Cale had made his own preparations. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies were already in position. Along with federal agents who'd been monitoring Cassius's communications, Cassius Holbrook. Agent Patterson's voice boomed through a megaphone. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up. The standoff lasted 30 minutes. Cassius, desperate and cornered, tried to negotiate, tried to bribe, tried to threaten. But his empire of fear had crumbled the moment his victims found the courage to speak. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Cassius looked directly at Lyra. You think you've won? You think you can just walk away from everything I've given you? I haven't walked away from anything, she said, taking Cale's hand. I've walked toward everything I ever wanted. And what's that? It's freedom, love, the right to choose my own life. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying Cassius and his men to federal custody, Cale pulled Lyra into his arms. The nightmare was over, but their life together was just beginning. So what happens now? She asked, echoing her question from the courthouse steps. Now we rebuild, he said, gesturing toward the ranch house that had once been his prison and was now their sanctuary. We fix what's broken, we plant new seeds, and we trust that tomorrow will be better than today. And if it's not, then we'll face it together. 6 months later, Cale stood in the same spot where he'd first held Lyra in his arms, but everything had changed. The ranch was alive again, new paint on the house, flowers in the garden, the sound of laughter echoing across the pastures. Lyra's family had moved to Colorado, her father's business rebuilt with the restitution money from Cassius's conviction. Are you ready? She asked, adjusting his tie. I've been ready since the night you stumbled into my life. They walked hand in hand toward the minister who waited beneath an arch of wildflowers, toward friends and family who'd gathered to celebrate their love. toward a future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story as they exchanged vows. Cale thought about the man he'd been broken, hiding, afraid to risk his heart again. And he thought about the woman who'd seen past his scars to the possibility of healing. He'd shown him that love wasn't about avoiding loss, but about choosing to love anyway. "I promise to stand with you in the light and in the shadows," he said, his voice carrying across the valley where they'd found each other. "To choose you every day, in every way, for as long as we both shall live. And I promise to be your partner in building something beautiful," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "To trust in our love even when the world seems dark, and to never stop believing in the power of two hearts that refuse to be broken." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cale kissed his wife and knew that some stories don't end, they just begin again, stronger and more beautiful than before. The broken rancher had stepped out of the shadows at last, and the fire in his heart would burn bright for the rest of his days.